Okay, we've been starting our look at Descartes, at the Discourse on Method. We've seen a couple videos talking to us a little bit about Descartes and who Descartes was, and talking a little bit about the, particularly the first part of the discourse. So I'm just going to jump in here and make a few comments, and I'm interested in this part to have you to start to compare Descartes to particularly to Socrates. Okay, so Descartes is called the father of modern philosophy, and he set philosophy on a different path and a different way of looking at it. Okay, that doesn't mean that the other views disappeared. Philosophy sort of keeps everything, but this was a very influential way of looking at philosophy that had implications for some of the later philosophers that we're going to look at too, who saw themselves as following out Descartes' lead. To some of them, Descartes' dead end. So keep that in mind. Okay, the Discourse and Method is one of these books. It's not a treatise. It's not like reading St. Thomas Aquinas. You've got to keep all the arguments. It's more like Boethius or the Apology. It's kind of this piece. Someone's talking about their lives. It's more autobiographical than anything we've seen before. But in many ways, you can think about Descartes as the author and Descartes as the character, the narrator of his Discourse on Method. And there may be some difference. People suggest that maybe what Descartes means is not the same as what Descartes says. Okay, so you heard Dr. Annandale talk about false modesty, okay, and irony. Those are two things that are going on, and they're different too. So our irony is suggesting something different by using the opposite words. False modesty is making claims about yourself that we all realize aren't true, but you're trying to downplay it. And why are you doing that? Is it because you're embarrassed or because you have ulterior motives? And a lot of people suspect Descartes of ulterior motives. Okay, one thing, let's start off with, we'll look at same and different. Okay, so the same feature is this, that Descartes sees what he's doing as the search for truth and wisdom. So this is the old-timey view of philosophy. Philosophy is still about the truth. Descartes believes there is such a thing as the truth and that people can get to the truth. Same thing as Plato, same thing as St. Thomas Aquinas. Maybe not the same thing as in our modern day. A lot of people don't believe there is such a thing as truth. And don't believe that people could get to maybe the capital T truth, or maybe we can get to our truth. So we are going to have to get to that and see if philosophy had anything to do with that view. I think it did, and I think I'm going to try to show you that as we move on. So here's a quote. I have always had a most earnest desire to know how to distinguish the true from the false, in order that I might be able clearly to discriminate the right path in life and proceed in it with confidence. So you see both themes, truth and then wisdom. Truth is supposed to help me become a wise person. So for Descartes, he buys into that. He still thinks that that's what he's trying to do. Okay, he disagrees though with some very important points, and this is the most important point that I think we should keep in mind, because a lot of the other things that he thinks follows from this. Okay, so he says at the very beginning of the discourse, so we don't miss it, good sense is of all the things among men the most equally distributed. Everybody's got the same amount of good sense. And I think of good sense, maybe it means common sense. It's kind of like an ability to figure out what's what. Okay? Doesn't mean we can't develop that. He talks about that in a moment. He says that the real reason why people disagree is because they've got the wrong method, they've made an intellectual mistake. But one of the reasons they disagree is not because most people are deluded or well, to put it frankly, living in the cave that Plato talked about. So there is the big difference. Plato says we're all in this cave. We need to get out of it. We need to see things. If we're going to see the truth, it's seeing things in a radically different way than we typically do. And Descartes saying, we basically have a good grasp on life, on how the world works, and we don't need to be illuminated. Um, Optimism. I think Descartes is a very optimistic person. The diversity of our opinions, he says, consequently does not arise from some being endowed with a larger share of reason than others. So Socrates isn't better off because he's so much smarter than us. But solely from this, that we conduct our thoughts along different ways and do not fix our attention on the same objects. For to be possessed of a vigorous mind is not enough. The prime requisite is rightly to apply it. So wisdom is something that we need to develop in our lives. We aren't naturally born wise. Descartes isn't saying that. Okay, so maybe that's in his favor, a plus, that he gets that. Okay, but he does, and maybe this is hard to understand. How can you not have the right method if you've got good sense, and shouldn't you have grabbed the right method too? How can you have this basic proclivity to know what's what, and just simply lack a method? Okay, maybe Plato makes more sense here when we say, well, we're just totally deluded about this. So, consequently, if it's just method, then that's the reason why we don't know very much, and we've been constantly in a fog about things. So Descartes is very concerned with disagreements and the lack of agreement amongst philosophers. He's also at the cusp of the scientific revolution. So there's a sense that uh, what we've thought about things for the last 1500 years is totally wrong. And we are learning new things that we did not know before. So a couple quotes here for myself. I've never fancied my mind to be in any respect more perfect than those of the generality. My present design then is not to teach. He's not going to be a teacher. Teaching is part of the problem. And this is kind of is this ironic point because isn't he teaching by writing this? But that's something to think about. But solely to describe the way in which I have endeavored to conduct my own. So he's putting out his project as an individual project. That's just the way I did it. Okay, but you always wonder. But you're writing this book. You want us to read it. You want us to do what you're. So there's a little bit of that's the false modesty part. That yeah, he can't really mean that. As soon as I'd finished the entire course of study, another quote, he found that I completely changed my mind. Everything that I had been taught was wrong. How many times have people ever told you that? Usually they say that when they're young. Later on, they oh well, no, I was kind of overly after you. Okay, and so this leads to his rejection of tradition. So good sense, get the correct method. Other methods have not been correct. We don't need help in this. Okay, it's partly a rejection of faith, even though he does admit in the discourse that he is a Christian, he believes in the truths of the faith, but faith is not supposed to be a means that we're going to have. Reason alone can do all of this in Descartes' mind. So this big individual emphasis, and the emphasis is it's crystallized in my mind to these two principles that we need to start over. We need to start from scratch. Part two, he talks about the house that's just been so much added on over the years, it's a mess. Best thing, just tear it down and start over. And the other piece is I need to do it myself. Okay, both of those, I think the last one is probably one of the odder ones. Okay, so I'm pitting Descartes and Socrates, and I want you to start thinking about what is the difference between these two. We talked about the similarities, search for wisdom, and the difference, this kind of individual one person show that Descartes has in mind. His optimism about success. If I just do it right, I'll get there. Okay, Socrates, even when he got farther than other people, he was always rather humble about it and saying, well, maybe I'm not right. Okay, we need to continue to test this. We need to continue to talk about this. And that uh, third point is the kind of communal aspect of philosophy that Socrates has that Descartes seems to be throwing out. Okay, the cave, too. We're not in the cave. Now, Descartes doesn't talk about the cave, but I think we know the cave, and I think that's one of the implications that that's not a good metaphor for philosophy. Okay, so we're trying to change the metaphor of philosophy, change the way we look at it. So, draw out a couple of these points, and then we will wind this up. So, philosophy should not be a refinement of common sense knowledge. Okay, common sense knowledge, like in the cave. Well, we have some sense of what's going on, but we don't really see the truth behind it, and so we need to refine it. So the cave sees the real cats, whereas outside the cave we see the real cats. In the cave we see the statues of cats. Okay, common sense is not to be totally trusted. Whereas Descartes, if he means good common sense by good sense, we should trust it. Okay, philosophy is more of an individual enterprise for Descartes. That seems to raise the value of teachers into question. Do we need teachers? Okay, but this is kind of a questionable one. Descartes, isn't he trying to be a teacher, or what's going on with that? Rejection of trying to take stock of what other people said. We don't need to try to, as St. Thomas laid out all these objections. Here's what these people said. Here's what those people said. Let's see if we can't figure out what they're all trying to get at. Descartes says, just throw that all out. Let's just start over. So spending time in the agora, talking to other people, is not the picture of philosophy that Descartes wants us to have. Okay. Oops. Rather, this view of philosophy that we get from particularly the Phaedo, where we have a bunch of people who not only have shared their lives together, but share their ideas. They're all, have studied philosophy like Cebes and Simmias. They've become somewhat adept at what they're doing, and they're working together to figure out what's true and wise to believe. Instead, we have this image, a philosopher sitting in a room by himself and contemplating his own thoughts. Descartes says over and over again, I needed to figure out my own thoughts about this. So let's leave you with one question. So if philosophy should solve problems and move on to new ones, even Descartes says that, it should be like geometry, then one question you might raise is, whose problems is it solving, if it's a particularly individual enterprise? And this is one of the questions that I want to raise, and I want to go to John Stuart Mill, who's the next philosopher we'll look at, because I think he gives a kind of an answer to how Descartes' view of philosophy can be socialized and brought into society and make it useful for all of us, if we're not going to get it out of school and follow Socrates. Okay, let me let that off. We'll back to the discourse in the next video, and keep on reading.